Okay, so welcome to the Nasty, Brutish, and Short podcast. So, I'm Parker.
I'm Taylor.
Yeah, I'm Vicente.
This is the first of what will hopefully be many podcasts on a series of different topics. In this first podcast, it's going to be a little bit different, just because we're trying to get the format right and introduce everything. So we'll just start telling a little bit about ourselves. We all went to the same college and we were all on our college debate team, and we all like having conversations with each other, so we thought it'd be a good idea to do a podcast together on just a number of different issues. A lot of them are probably going to be political or social, but me personally, I'm a political science major and international relations, a little bit of French. My political leanings are somewhere very left. I would currently identify as a syndicalist. Don't know if that label is going to stick. And my general sort of philosophic outview that you'll probably hear me reiterate a few times on this podcast is somewhere in the realm of nihilism, absurdism. So whoever wants to go next can introduce themselves.
Hey, I'm Taylor. I'm a biochemistry, molecular biology major, theater minor, because I can't pick what I want to do with my time. As Parker said, we all went to the same college together, and I was on the debate team as well. It just didn't line up near as cohesively with my major as it did with pretty much everyone else's major, which is a fun thing when you have to debate science things. God, I'm rambling. Please cut a lot of this. Political leaning, I'm very probably, like, if you went off like a political compass thing, libertarian left. I'm sure there's a fancy name for where I'm at on the spectrum. I don't know it, because I don't think that's helpful to most people who are not obsessed with politics, but regardless, because what was Parker's label? I have no clue what that is. And then social kind of philosophical output, I am also towards the more nihilism end, a little bit more towards existentialism, though, than true nihilism or true absurdism, where Parker tends to lie.
Cool, my name is Vicente. As mentioned, we all went to the same college. I'm currently a political science and international relations double major with a minor in Spanish. In terms of my general life philosophy, I do definitely try to live my life by the more stoical guidelines, as laid out by Zeno of Sidon, or Marcus Aurelius. However, politically, I fall definitely somewhere more in the realm of classical liberal, as well as a social democrat, or somebody who is very centrist but still slightly liberal leaning. However, I do tend to be very Machiavellian in my views, and will do kind of what best ever serves myself.
Benny, we should also mention that you're Catholic as the most religious person.
Yes,
oh, yes.
I am also... Yes. I'm violently Catholic, which is an undertone which underlies everything. If you really wanted to get technical and talking political and religious ideologies, I am a liberal Catholic, insofar as the term applies to applying to liberal values as a Catholic.
Oh, worth noting as well, since I forgot religion as well, I'm a naturalist pagan, ? We're working on it. Please don't ask me to elaborate more at the moment, maybe later episodes, but at the moment, we're figuring it out.
And then let's just explain a little bit about the podcast. We can do some discussion here too, because I'm sure we each have kind of a different view of how we expect every episode to go. But my sort of outlook for it is that we were just going to take a topic and then discuss it ad nauseum until we're bored of it and we move on. So each episode will probably be just one long topic. But what were you guys thinking for how a general podcast episode would go like?
I mean, that's my general thought too. Just kind of our ramblings, but now recorded.
Yeah, that was my basic assumption. Just much like I do in real life, cause chaos wherever I possibly can, and try to upend any sort of productive conversation.
This is going to be the weird episode, because we have each proposed what will hopefully be a relatively light topic, mine being a little bit of an exception. But we're just... So some of these topics will probably come up again. In fact, I know a couple of them probably will come up frequently. But we're just going to start off with Vinny's topic. So Vinny, would you say what your topic is and then explain your thought process in picking it and what you want to hear us talk about with it?
Okay, so the topic that I kind of generally proposed is something that I like to run over like all the time, and that's, can true secularization really exist? Insofar as like society, and the main underpinning that I think about secularization in is that the vast majority of any sort of moral values in any society have fundamentally been tied to religious tenets. Even though we believe mistakenly in Western society that we have kind of, quote, freed ourselves from Christian religious tenets, insofar as our sense of moral justice and moral righteousness is still derived from Judeo-Christian values at the end of the day. So, can like a true secularization, or like can morals be derived from something other than that in a society already where our influences have so pushed us to the point that we are just in a continual echo chamber of certain values? That is kind of my broad idea about talking about sex.
Okay, I kind of want to start off because I have my proposal. It'll be an episode one day, but on laïcité, which is the French concept of secularism. But
How's that going right now?
laïcité, oh, I love it. It's great. But I think that secularism really is something that can sort of exist, but it requires a reframing of society to a point of view of community that isn't centered so much around religion as it would be around different axes like the state or economic interests, depending on what sort of view you're taking of it. So we could have like Marxian economic bindings for the community, or we could have like a real state binding where it's essentially that we become one people, not necessarily through ethnicity or religion, but through a shared communal values I think that can be derived from rationalistic goals. How we've seen secularism play out in the U.S., it's not really secularism, it's just not government sanctioned it's not government sanctioned sectarianism. In France, laïcité is literally banning of showing of things that are religious, or really a discussion about the religious in public spaces, which I actually support more than that system. Full well knowing that it's it is discriminatory, because some religions do require display of religious apparel, like the yarmulke for Judaism, but more prominently the hijab for Muslims. Just for the point that there's not really a need if you don't introduce religion as something that's public, then it just stays something that's private. And that's my definition of secularism, is not the elimination of religion, but the barring of it from being necessarily about public discourse. So if you want to rebut, or if Taylor has something to add on this.
I don't know. I mean, I disagree with this, because this is talking about secularism, obviously, within our modern day society. I don't think it's really like, I don't know, I'm not sure you can really run like a counterfactual where in an alternate universe, could secularism be established? I don't think it can be, unfortunately, because at the end of the day, every community and every nation, whether it's a large or small group, has been so fundamentally influenced by some religiosity, whether that be Shintoism, an Abrahamic religion, local practices, traditions. Your ethics derive from those sources, and even if you do divorce yourself from those values, one cannot escape the culture you are fundamentally raised in, and thus the culture the world is raised in. And just because, like you say, that, for example, the US does not sanction the binding of church and state, you can't ignore that a lot of major laws come from the Ten Commandments. That is an example of like secularism, but it's still at the end of the day underpinned by religious ideas. And I think that happens wherever you go, and that at the end of the day, it is inescapable in our modern society, unless somehow you're to get a nation in which that entire nation forgot religiosity, never had one, never interacted with religion, and created an ethic code from there.
Just to use some of that logic and kind of like specifically rip into the example of France and like laïcité, even at that, let's look at like what France actually does as a country, because France behaves very flagrantly Catholic in most religious contexts, right? And uses those ideas to actively oppress religions that are not Christian or Catholic, i.e. the problems we're seeing right now with the cartoons of Muhammad and all the different crimes perpetrated against mosques in France, right? Insofar as the vast majority of societies do have a natural sense of what's right, quote unquote, which, like Taylor said, is derived from the cultural perspective of that nation. I don't think that you can really have like a true secularization in terms of like an actual authentic separation of church and state. And even France, to just use the example again, tried with the cult of pure reason. And it still just collapses at the end of the day, because as much as you want to quash ideas of religion, you may quash the religion nominally. However, you will not quash the fundamental ideas of how people feel and perceive what is justice and what is just.
Sorry. No, but also in talking about France too, and like the issues facing Islam, I think a lot of religions do demand public acts of religion. To decry one's religion in public, but to accept it in a private sphere is hypocrisy, is not allowed, whether you're talking about Islam or you're talking about Christianity. That's prevalent throughout many Bible stories, that you cannot praise Christ in one place and then decry him in another. I think you run into that problem too. A lot of religion does demand publicity, or at least not necessarily publicity, but like action in public spaces. You must decry your faith not only to yourself, but declare it like to the world around you. And I think that runs into a major problem as well, because then where do you have churches if not in public spaces? Where do you have any sort of places of worship generally, if not using land that is in some way influencing the place around it, or even is on state land? For example, the Notre Dame being owned by the French government, if I'm remembering that correctly. Like that's
no, Notre Dame is owned by the Catholic Church. No church that is on sacred consecrated ground can be owned by any temporal government.
Cool. I thought the French government owned it.
It is considered a national monument and designated as a national heritage site, but it does belong to the Catholic Church.
Okay. I thought they owned that for some reason.
They did own it when they stole it from the Catholic Church in the Revolution, and then they kindly gave it back because the Catholic Church threatened to revoke its status as a sacred place.
I say, if
they didn't own it.
Okay. Well, I guess I'll just respond. First off, to the examples that we get on like the French Revolution. I think that it's difficult to argue that we can't have religion when we see it sort of enforced from a governmental level. Like, obviously, it hasn't worked under the USSR, and I think that it's trending towards working in France. It's not a perfect process, but it clearly didn't work during the French Revolution, because, basically that fails fairly immediately within the decade, and Napoleon sort of has his rapprochement with the Pope. But I do think that there are examples of societies that have evolved sort of naturally through communal bonding, and I realize that these are imperfect examples, but they're sort of a limited lens because religion is so widespread that it's fairly common. The first example, and I'll just point out the weakness in this, is Scandinavian countries, incredibly low levels of religiosity. Most Scandinavians would identify as not religious, even though most of them belong to the Church of like Denmark or the Church of Norway. But most of them don't attend church. They don't read the Bible. They consider themselves secular. And the difficulty in that is the ethnic homogeneity, obviously, right?
Mm-hmm. But just to chime in, though, how much of Scandinavian morality and legality is predicated off of Christian tenets?
But you can have things that are predicated off of it. But I would say, what is religion except sort of a codification of early human laws?
Yeah, I'll give you that.
Yeah. And my second example is Japan, because you have Shintoism, obviously. But that's more of like a respect for yourself and nature, and it has religious roots. As to the religiosity of Shintoism, Taylor already looks like she disagrees strongly with the. I haven't seen strong evidence. Yeah, I haven't seen strong evidence of religiosity from observing Japan or talking with Japanese people that I've met, but it's much less of a religion, I would say, than maybe Catholicism, Islam, Hinduism, those sorts of things, and even like Confucianism. If you can say that China has a religion, isn't like really a religion in that sense, because it's more of a philosophy put into practice, I think.
And I just think like this also brings up ideas specifically around Shintoism, and to draw like an imperfect comparison would be like cultural Catholicism. Like insofar that it is more an action of respect in going through the rituals, not necessarily because you believe in them, but because you believe that they are culturally important or that they are something that you are doing simply because other people are doing. Is that religiosity in some sense? Because even like insofar as the vast majority of Scandinavian people don't read the Bible or really actively participate in the religion, how many people still put up a Christmas tree every Christmas? How many people still go to Mass every Christmas and Easter, or some other type of religious service? Where do you draw the line, I guess, between being culturally religious and having some sort of religious practice that is like done for religious purposes? I think that's kind of, at least to me, the crux of the matter with secularism is that what defines religion at the end of the day, and in what way can we actually quantify religion or quantify its effects on society?
That's a sort of difficult distinction to make. For Christmas, it's variable, and obviously we mostly have the U.S. perspective on that. But I wouldn't even really say that for most people that it is a religious holiday. I think quite a few people go to Mass and stuff if they're practicing their religion. But for the most part, I'd call it a consumerist holiday. Like you see lots of people, like in Japan, they practice Christmas, even though they're not Christian.
That they do.
So
which is great, because theologically they're still celebrating the birth of our Lord Jesus Christ. So theologically, the religions are reaping the same benefits.
Oh my god!
If we're gonna get crass,
they're not giving money to the Pope, though, Vinny.
Oh my god!
Well,
they are not giving
does money to the Pope really matter when you're doing honor to the Lord Jesus Christ?
It's not really about honor to the Lord Jesus Christ. It is like a very secularized. For context, the Aberration around Shintoism and also with this, I lived in Japan briefly when I was growing up, so I experienced a few Christmases in Japan and also went to lots of Shinto shrines as well as Buddhist temples in Japan. So that is how I have that experience. But no, it's pretty secular. It's like the shops putting up advertisements being like, it's Christmas time, buy your presents, and like Christmas tree decorations and wreaths. It's not about Christ. It's about getting you to buy things. It's like it's part of the westernization of like parts of Japanese culture.
And what moral underpinning predicated the West?
Judaism, if you believe Marx.
Christianity. Christianity. Because as appealing as Judaism is, it was really Christianity that sold it to the West.
Did they sell it, or did they say, be Christian or
but
die?
Like, insofar as Constantine converted the entire Roman Empire to Christianity, even with, when you look at Judaism, it was a really hard sell to the Romans and the others that they couldn't eat pork and had to cut off their foreskins. Like, that is just a hard sell as a religion. Whereas Christianity, when St. Peter is freed from those obligations, it's a lot easier of a sell. And is a lot more appealing, especially to the cultures that were present within Europe.
Well, I was having this discussion with another friend, and really, I think the difference between Christianity and Judaism in terms of like becoming a mainstream religion, is that Judaism doesn't want converts necessarily. Like Christianity is about proselytizing. Exactly. Judaism is we are a chosen people. We're gonna keep it that way. So, exactly. Yeah, but...
So I don't think it's about the sell. I think it's about Judaism didn't really go around to people and say, hi, you're Christian now, or you don't have a head anymore. Whereas the Christians, and the Muslims as well, absolutely did. I think that's the sell there.
Or are we just removed from the times that the Jews actually did it? Because even with that, when you want to split hairs on the Old Testament, the Sumerians, the other various pagan peoples that the Jews interacted with still did assimilate many groups into what we would consider the modern Jews right now. So I think that they are just more far removed. Although we do have the chosen people narrative, they're just more far removed from their legwork of conversion.
But I don't think it was conversion. It was genociding of rival cultures. That's not a conversion. That's just
They
removing
genocided
opposition.
and assimilated the remnants. So there was still an assimilation with that, right? Like there was more than one Semitic people, but the vast majority have now been subsumed into Israeli and Jewish ethnicity.
Just to go back to a point though that where we were kind of talking about the whether Christmas would count as sort of a secular or a non-secular thing. I think that you can have religious roots for things because a lot of that is like superstition. In the same way that like the Brothers Grimm like present like moral quandaries in the form of stories. Like that's essentially, at least from my perspective, what the Bible is essentially just a lot of moral parables about how you should live your life. But additionally, we kind of talked about, how do you have private religion but public secularism? And I actually think Christianity is a good model for this in a certain facet because, early on in Christianity, you get this sort of perspective that the church, I don't even remember the exact word, is just the community. So you can have small communities of people getting together. And I think that would qualify as secularism because it's not in government spaces and it's not public. It's like groups of community members who belong to this religious community gathering. But that's not at the level of the state. It's at the level of like a neighborhood or of like a friend group or something. And I think that's totally acceptable. Like we wouldn't say that, can you ever get like a communist free state? Even though there are meetings of communists, like America's a communist free state. Like we wouldn't say that it's influenced heavily by communism. Even though there are meetings between people like that.
Yeah, I don't know. I just grapple more with it. I think that so many of our values are predicated, at least in the West, by Christian tenets that it's so very difficult to fundamentally remove ourselves from that I am highly dubious if we can ever achieve a, quote, true secularization, insofar that our sense of moral justice and righteousness is derived from the cultures that we...
But that I feel like that's a difficult level to obtain
that's...
or to argue for. Because your true secularism, I feel like, as being described so far, is that it has to be completely uninfluenced by religion. And there's two problems with that. One is that there's a substantial overlap. I mean, religion has talked about a lot in its existence in the human race. Like, it's covered everything from earthquakes to, like, specific moral quandaries as to, like, what fabric you should wear. So it's difficult to have a society that doesn't in some way overlap with religion. The second is that it's so pervasive. I don't think that any Western legal code is uninfluenced by Christianity, and it's because they all had to grapple with it. Because it's so pervasive. I mean, you have the church as the central authority for centuries, and law is really just a process of building on itself for more and more specific instances and changes in technology and society. So there is all going to be influenced by religion.
But
good job, Parker. You called me out on me.
But can you? No, that's not a call out. You don't get, like, I don't think it's fair to ask for a counterfactual world in which religion doesn't exist to be like, yes, secularism exists there. That's the grappling, though, is the problem.
Called me out on using the Freudian style argument, where Freud would provide a complete system in a complete world and ask you to argue against it. But he would spell out his logic trains in such a way that it was highly ineffective to argue against Freud. And that's why that Freud's ideas all fall within the context of one another, because he just creates a complete world system. So, like, I'll give you that, Parker. Like, you point out the weakness in that point of view. However, I do think that what we waffle on is what is the definition of true secularism.
Well, I kind of gave a definition. Maybe we all have different ones of it. But mine is just...
Yeah, because I'm certainly not working by your definition of secularism.
Yeah, my difference with that religion is not... I guess it falls in the private domain as opposed to the public domain. So there's not public celebrations about religion. I mean, there can be things like Christmas, but they get sort of stripped of their religious connotations. like, it is essentially Christmas in Japan is my idea of secularism in the world, is that we can still celebrate these things that have been inspired by history and religion, but the focus isn't on religion. I mean, maybe it is privately for some people, but it's not the general consensus that these things are religion. I think that you could kind of see that if you asked any 10-year-old, they'd be like, if you asked them what they're most excited about on Christmas, it wouldn't be, I'm really excited to celebrate the birth of Christ. It's, I'm really excited to get presents. I want that new PS5 or whatever.
You obviously didn't go to Catholic school, Parker.
I did go to Catholic school, thank you.
For a year.
Well, technically 5 years if you count college.
Okay, Catholic college, but Catholic grade school. But yeah, like, insofar as religion is just an absolute mess and a nightmare of a moral system to negotiate, like, what is anything? I'll dip into my Catholic nihilism right here. Like, Catholicism is sick, and, like, I do think that we should stop pushing the narrative that, like, secularism is something that, like, we want and desire, because that's not necessarily true. Like, by your definition, Parker, any government that, like, isn't a caliphate is inherently secular.
Well, can you explain that? And also, I guess I'm somewhat confused on your idea that religion is a moral vanguard. Like, maybe it was in the early times, but I mean, recently we've seen, like, numerous instances of the Pope just following Western countries, like, on gay marriage, for example. Like, that's a really easy example to throw out.
I mean, like, insofar as, like, we see what the Pope made an official statement on gay marriage was, but when you look at statements like that, the Pope really said nothing new. The Pope just pointed out what was already compatible with the theology. So, insofar as Catholicism could have already been interpreted that way, it was just that the Pope now pointed it out in an official statement. So it wasn't necessarily even Catholicism growing or expanding in any sort of meaningful way. With the Pope's announcement that, like, civil unions are an okay thing to have, because even with that, the Catholic Church still worldwide does not recognize a civil marriage as a valid marriage. So any sort of institution that is actively participating in sanctioning gay marriages, the Catholic Church recognizes no marriages from any of those institutions as valid. So then you grapple with the internal logic of Catholicism. But what I mean by the caliphate statement is when you're saying that once religion is removed from the public sphere and turned into more of a private institution or is not officially governmentally sanctioned, you still have countries, i.e. France, that don't have an official state religion, but still flagrantly support Catholicism in their policies. I would contend that that nation is culturally Catholic, as well as a nation that is upholding Catholic values, albeit not in an officially sanctioned manner. I would argue that that is not true secularism on base when you have a government that is acting in that way. I don't think you can fundamentally divorce a government from religion in that sense. And even in the United States does flagrantly tend to support Protestant evangelicalism, because that is the foundations of what this country was.
Yeah. And you can see that even now in the US, like, all sorts of women's issues, that a lot of the arguments tie back into religiosity or religious freedom and that kind of conflict that exists. I'd also argue the US is not really secular because of the way, at least currently, our politics is so fundamentally influenced by evangelical ideas, Protestant ideas that come about, as many said, from, like, Protestantism being the founding kind of principles of the United States.
Okay, but I see your point that the private lives of individuals obviously have some effect on how the state operates, at least if you're in a democracy. But I don't necessarily... my argument wasn't that we have secular nations now. My argument was that I think that a moral system can evolve outside of religion, and we've seen that happen. We can even say that we've seen it happen with things like the French Revolution, or communist movements that have happened in various countries. So I don't think that it's necessarily fair to say that we have any example countries, except maybe the ones that I mentioned, that aren't somewhat influenced by religion. But I would say that it's also difficult to say that, like for the example of France, like you say that their culture aligned with Catholicism because most of them are Catholic and they seem to uphold Catholic values. But that there's a difference between that they're doing that as a state-sanctioned thing and their goals just happen to overlap with Catholicism. Because I'm not saying that Catholicism will just die out as a religion, and then suddenly there will just be this idea that there is no sort of moral system influenced by it. Because, Catholicism, even Catholicism and Islam probably have quite a bit of overlap. They're based off of Judaism to some extent. So you could say that Catholicism is in line with Islamic values, right? So I don't think that you can necessarily say that there is a state that won't ever uphold Catholic values, but you can say that they're not doing it for Catholicism and they're doing it in a secular way. And there, some parts of religion are good, some parts aren't so good or change. And so
that's heresy.
That's heresy. The Pope has never changed his mind.
You're right, Parker. Most religions aren't, but there is one thing: the Holy Roman Catholic and Apostolic Church that has a monopoly on everything that is good, holy, and true.
Oh my god.
Although I did just see that we just hit a half hour, so do we want to kind of quit with this sample, because I know we're probably going to cover this same topic in later episodes and we can have more concentrated planning and arguments.
Okay, do we want to do closing thoughts on it, or should we just move on to the next one?
I think we should just kind of closing generally say that we're not attempting to reach conclusions. This is just more about a general discussion. We're not going to have answers. It's just more.
That's fair enough. It's the dialectic. We're just presenting arguments, so then whoever's listening can come up with their own conclusions. So the next topic is tailors.
Yeah.
So let's introduce this.
All right. So this topic is a direct result of me deciding to rewatch the Star Wars sequels today and continuing to grapple with the social conflict that is Kylo Ren and the broader implications. So this topic is about the not the secularization, the sexualization and romanticizement of villains and villainy. Because that's been a pretty big problem, or at least a pretty big, not necessarily problem, discussion in, I think kind of in the last five or so years is when it's really been discussed. And I've seen this discussed not only in a feminist lens, but just more of a more broad societal lens of is this good? Is this bad? Should we write villains to be empathetic? Should we write them in a sexualized way? Should we write them to just be evil? Is it okay if you're a simp for Kylo Ren, despite the fact that he's a shitty person? It's kind of that broader discussion. So I guess, DJ, what are a couple examples that you guys have seen of really romanticized or sexualized villains in kind of more modern context?
Not a modern context, but I think what we could consider the first concentrated context of the romanticization of villainy within Western society. And the Catholic part of my brain is absolutely screaming at me for using a Protestant author, but I think it would definitely be Paradise Lost. With Milton. I definitely think that in that context, Satan is portrayed as rather appealing. And I do know that there's a statue in a church in Italy where the guy, he carved Satan way too sexily. And they made him remove it. Because it was just too...
And then he carved a more sexy Satan.
Exactly. So I think we've been grappling with this for a long time. And I think it also just appeals on base to just the human gravitation towards taboo. I think whatever you define as good or righteous, humans typically are no, I want the other thing, because now there's a whole mysterious context around it that makes it seem appealing. So I think it's been something that we've been grappling with for quite a long time. And I do think we're seeing those currents now, and like you mentioned, now we have a more feminist, progressive idealism that we can weigh it against.
I have a mixed perspective.
Parker, what's your
my first thought, and this is going to sound a little weird, is Cleopatra. But I'm specifically thinking about Shakespeare's Cleopatra, where she's a seductress of Antony.
Okay, yeah.
But to some extent, I already can see some problems with that. I mean, there's more general things like hell is depicted as having, sexy demon girls or whatever. But I think some of that has just come from Christianity. Another example maybe, and I don't know, I haven't read Le Morte Arthur, but I would assume that Morgana Le Fay is somewhat sexualized in that, like or there's like the charming beauty sort of thing.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, if we're being honest, pretty much any female villain throughout most media is sexualized, and that's intentionally done to, like, delineate, female sexuality as bad. I don't know, I guess more where I see this kind of discussion is sexualization of male villains, because female villains have always been, like, sexualized. They've always been, like, quote-unquote bad, or shown as evil to tell you, like, this is why girls shouldn't be promiscuous, because that's evil. We need to associate that with villainy, but I think it's more like male villains being kind of sexualized by women that's sparking kind of interesting conversations, at least for me, in discussing, like, how we interact with villains more broadly, because, to be honest, men, you've kind of had the sexy villain lady trope your entire existence. You can even go back to stories of Lilith as, like, sexy demon lady.
And I think we can examine kind of, like, the base that like, the foundations of sexualization might offer some insight into the situation we're currently seeing. Insofar as, like, for the vast majority of, like, Western Christianity, we interpreted sex and sexuality in a way that conflated it with being sinful. And so we've had millennia of creating a taboo around it. And I think, like, within the modern context then, obviously, like, in terms of, like, patriarchal society structures, that's where we see, i.e. the women villain trope as well. And we have this baseline attitude that is continually being reinterpreted just in different ways. And I think that leads to what we're seeing now. And I think the symptom, or more like the cause of the sexualization of, like, male villains now, is a shifting viewpoint and the cracks in the foundation of a patriarchal society that we are seeing. I think that would be kind of where we see that develop. I don't know. I can't really speak to any sort of implications for that. That's not really my broad specialty, but I do think that built off the taboo, insofar as we are deconstructing what we have traditionally perceived, but I think the baseline attitudes and conflation with sexuality as something that is fundamentally wrong and sinful plays a role in the way that we are looking at it now.
Well, I actually would argue against that point, because I do think that I don't know if it would necessarily qualify as villains, but I think that the whole problem of sexuality and sexualization of characters has had some male role sort of from the early stages. I mean, we can just look at Narcissus as an example. I don't know, I wouldn't necessarily qualify him as a villain, but he's definitely not, something to aspire to. And I think it's because sexuality can only really be viewed in two lenses. One is sexualization of yourself, like you, like, observe yourself as beautiful, and thus, admire yourself more, and that's related to hubris, as is the case of Narcissus. And the other way is that you're sexually desired by others, and that can have multiple connotations. But I actually think that this trend is a response, like, this increasing prominence of this trend is a response to the sexualization of good guys, or, like, good people, I guess. Because we could consider, for example, I'm totally blanking on this name at the moment. I just had it ready.
Let's just go stock 1950s griller dad with two kids, right? Like, that's like the ideal thing, and that was a vision that certainly got sexualized, I would say.
As much as that plain white bread of a man can be sexualized, yeah.
And that, for the longest time, at least in the United States, was seen as the ideal.
Yeah. I also think the trend kind of comes in response to not necessarily villains being written intentionally, like, in a kind of sexy or romantic context, but it's kind of through, like, a response to how people perceive characters, again, going back to the Star Wars sequels, because this is, I think, an easy example to draw out. First film, Kylo Ren was not written to be sexual or romanticized. He was written as a darker character. A whole bunch of women saw the film and decided that they liked his character. Then you have the second episode introducing gratuitous, shirtless Adam Driver scene. I think that was a direct response to people starting to sexualize a character that was written to be sexual. And, I think that happens with a lot of different characters and archetypes we see in media. These aren't people who necessarily have been written that way, but have developed that way because of kind of either fan-based response or media response to them, which is kind of interesting. It's a weird unintended side effect of, fan discourse.
So how much of a role, I guess, then I would ask, just thinking out of curiosity, is, the ideas of fetishization and otherizing play into this as well? Because when you think about it, the Latin lover trope is fundamentally drawn from an otherizing factor of Latin culture and Latin people within an Anglo context. And so the same fetishization we see, i.e. American soldiers in Vietnam, and widespread fetishization of Asian culture, what does that speak to of the fact that we always see the other as kind of appealing, and now in our more fictional contexts, we are now seeing the villain as the sexual and appealing other?
Well, I think it's definitely otherization, right? A lot of the discussions you see around these kinds of characters are definitely knowing that they're a villain, and that's the appeal. Is that they are not I don't know, I see a lot of good guys described as quote vanilla, boring, it's too plain. So I think it is about that otherization, and I think that could come from just it being a taboo, and at least in the US, and a lot of media produced in the US, is that sexuality is kind of repressed, and maybe this is just a weird manifestation of it.
Well, I kind of wonder if the sexualization of villains doesn't add to their moral, or add to their character in a certain way. It develops them as people, because we sort of see villains in, I guess, a limited perspective, because we're almost always from the point of view of the protagonist, unless you have some sort of stretched out, omnipotent view of the story. So, most villains throughout time have been somewhat sort of eternal enemies, in the fact of where you get the generic ones like Satan, who are seen in a very one-dimensional lens. And usually their physical characteristics are sort of reflective of their moral characteristics, like we see early depictions of Satan as, an ugly monster, or as a serpent or something else, which would create disgust. But, now that's sort of changed, if we get shows like Lucifer that have a very sexy Satan, but who's also a much more morally complicated character than Christian depictions of Satan, right? So I wonder if those two things don't go hand in hand.
Yeah.
If maybe we need sexuality as that sort of draw-in to sympathize with villainous characters, because that, as Vinny was saying, it seems like the sort of exotic fascination comes from the perspective of an outsider of that culture, somebody who wouldn't understand it. And I almost wonder if the sexualization doesn't sort of draw us into what could be considered an exotic, or a character that we don't necessarily empathize with as much.
Yeah, because it's the one thing that all humans can connect on, or that most humans can connect on. The vast majority of the human populace likes to screw. And I think it's something that connects and unites us all.
Yeah. Oh, I think, that's probably what it is. Just curious, do you guys think it's a net good or net bad thing?
I think it's net.
That villains are more sexualized?
I'd say net neutral. I think that it...
Net neutral? Okay.
I think it only becomes a huge problem when it's the sexualization and fetishization of an other. I think in the context of a fictional character, it remains relatively net neutral. Insofar as the fictional character does not have a lot of real-world parallels, i.e. Kylo Ren.
I would say it's maybe even a net good, because I think that it introduces new story dynamics. Because, what do you do when your protagonist is sexually interested in the antagonist? Or vice versa. And, I mean, that's kind of been a theme, right? We have some villains who are, sexually attracted to protagonists, and they have, they're, envious of them, or they really want to get with them or something.
Everybody likes
I
to
say time
screw.
for. I would say time for horny angst B plot.
We need more horny protagonists and antagonists. Bring on the fanfiction.
Fair enough. I don't know. I'm kind of two minds of this, but this also ties pretty heavily into, like, I don't know, my perceptions of feminist theory and stuff like that. On the one hand, I think it does provide more interesting narratives. I think it's interesting to show people having sexual appeal, romantic appeal that otherwise you wouldn't have. It's interesting. Also, I mean, yeah, if you like this character, you like this character. That's kind of your own thing, not my deal. But I also am of the other mind of what this teaches to people, especially towards, like, younger people getting into relationships, specifically women. Like, I think the bad boy trope and the sexualization of, like, quote, bad boys has been pretty bad for a lot of young girls, right? It results in them going after guys that treat them like shit, have, like, some sort of unresolved issues or emotional availability issues because they're seen as more desirable because they don't want to talk to you, right? Because they treat you badly, because they are the bad boy archetype that you've grown up seeing in media as being sexy, as being more interesting than a guy that would treat you well. So it's, yeah, I'm of two minds on this. I don't know. It's an interesting conundrum to discuss. Obviously, also that applies to men. Obviously, men growing up seeing, like, super, like, abusive, or, like, yeah, borderline abusive or abusive women in relationships, and thus, like, fetishizing that is also not good. I just think it's more pernicious towards.
Well, I wonder if we don't need to delineate between sort of modern sexualization and pre-modern. Like most relationships throughout, like, the Roman and Middle Ages were probably not based off of sexual attraction, but more off of, like, marriages of practicality. So in that way, sexualization almost makes no sense in those terms, because you're basically just going to be with whoever's practical. I mean, there are some, like, romantic efforts in, like, the French kingdom where it's, like, love for love's sake and courtship and stuff like that. And then you get the romantic period, but other than that, it's marriage is a practicality. So, as using Vinny's example, it's interesting that at the time Milton depicts Satan as, like, some sexual hot bad boy, when he's when it's not really an option for women, right? But ignoring the fact that most people couldn't even read probably at that point.
But maybe that's the appeal. Maybe you're stuck with your shitty husband in a marriage of convenience, and then you look at whatever the fucking town bad boy is. I don't know, maybe he doesn't go to church every Sunday. I don't know what qualifies for a medieval bad boy here. But it's like, he's interesting. Like, I think to, what is the book? Madame Bovary, as, like, an example of that, right? Like, she has her husband. Is she interested in her husband? No.
Yeah.
So maybe that's the appeal.
And I mean, Milton himself, I do think the verdict is out about whether or not he was closeted and repressed as a person. Especially after reading Paradise Lost. And a lot of Milton's other works definitely lean some type of way. But I don't know. The verdict's out. That's me shooting from the hip on highly speculative ideas. So
yeah, he did put a lot of effort in describing sexy Satan. A lot of effort.
The world's better for it.
An author that I know Taylor and I both like is that guy who's Oscar Wilde. Like, I feel like the sexual component of the painting of Dorian Gray is, like, a major factor of the book that lends to that sort of moral ambivalence of it.
I'm not sure Picture of Dorian Gray is the best example. I think it's more about beauty than sexuality, because I don't think those are the two same thing. I don't think Dorian was trying to, like, protect his appearance so he could continue to be laid. I think it was his own personal vanity, and I don't think that's necessarily, like, his sexuality being preserved in
I was kind of talking about that with, like, Narcissus, right? Because you have that sort of hubris element of it, where you're like, I'm beautiful, but then you... And is that, like, a sexual attraction to yourself, almost, in a way? Because one thing we've kind of failed to do so far in this discussion is really, like, qualify sexual attraction. Because, in some ways it's something that brings you closer to a person, but in another way it's something that distances you, right? I can't speak for Vinny, but I would say that Taylor and I probably have some anxiety issues that would make it difficult to approach somebody that we're sexually attracted to. So it adds an interesting component.
Is this a targeted attack? Is this an attack over the fact that I can't flirt with women?
I was talking about both of us, but sure, read it however you want.
I mean,
but
you guys never knew me in high school, so I think that would be where my moment was.
Yeah, but we have this weird sort of dichotomy where you're both attracted to a person, but also distanced from them by their sexual attraction. So it's hard to say from a story element, because obviously you're not approaching the character. I almost wonder if from this story perspective, if it's not a way to really like get a sort of intimacy that you can't get in your real life, because there's somebody that's infinitely approachable, because you can just always come back and watch them or read them as many times as you want, but they're also attractive to you. So it really is a fantasy, both for men and women, like with you, with Kylo Ren, or whoever, anybody else.
Oh my god, Arthur. It's just
call out, jeez.
It's just e-girls, man. It's just e-girls and simps, and it always has been. It was just manifested in a different way before we had the internet.
Yeah, Mark Antony.
I mean, I got that analysis.
Would follow Delphine. That's all I'm saying.
Definitely.
Okay, well, we can wrap up this topic if you all are ready for that. Okay.
Yeah.
Yep, that puts us in about
So,
yeah.
Our final topic, which was my topic, too broad, is does free will exist? So I'll just lay my perspective out there. I don't know if you agree with me or don't on this. But my perspective is free will doesn't and can't exist. So I'm a determinist. And I would say that there's two sort of determinisms. There's the hard determinism where basically like nothing is a factor at all. And then there's soft determinism, which is that there is some flexibility. I've heard it argued like things like quantum mechanics can explain free will. I don't know if I buy that argument. But my perspective is that essentially if you break the universe down into its most fundamental component, it's just math. And from that extent, everything is predetermined. Like, if you had a program, that you ran, it would always run in exactly the same way because it's just a component of math. And that's essentially how I see the universe, is that from these fundamental starting conditions, that you always end up with whatever result we're at. So like, us doing this podcast is the result of the formation of the universe and how atoms were arranged. But I guess a more succinct way of sort of putting my point is that if you could observe every single possible factor of any given situation, you would know exactly what the outcome was. So if we just froze time and then looked at every single facet, which would be incredibly extensive, like from air temperature to like whether the wind was blowing to the chemicals in your brain, you would know exactly how that situation would turn out from those factors if you had, perfect foresight and understanding of every single, scientific concept that's yet to be discovered. So,
I mean,
discuss.
Kind of, but like, even at that, to fall back on my Catholic lens, I should say, that perfect foresight and that perfect ability to see what may happen and what is to come and what has been, that is God. So, insofar that we acknowledge, and that Catholicism and other major religions acknowledge that God can see what's going to happen, does that necessitate that something would necessarily happen? I'm a lawfully centrist on free will. I do think it could swing either way, and I do think that most religions have offered a very lackluster justification and explanation for the possibilities of free will. But insofar as a person can make their own decisions, and oftentimes makes an irrational decision, I think is a greater indication of free will than anything else. I think that if most things were determined in that sense, humans would be primarily rational. So I guess that's kind of my thing with free will and with determinism, is that I'm lawfully on it. I don't know what I think about it, but I do enjoy playing with the idea.
Free will exists. It's my hot take. I think free will exists. Like, I agree with Parker to some extent that, like, there are certain laws of the universe that we cannot avoid, and that, obviously quantum mechanics will always be quantum mechanics. There are certain things we cannot do in this universe. However, I think the number of possibilities vastly outnumbers the number of things we can't do. And even if there is some sort of determinism, the fact that we are not aware of it, to me at least, is free will for all intents and purposes. We perceive it as free will, and I think people do have power at the end of the day.
I agree. I'll just put this out there. I agree that it's useful to have a sort of fuzzy definition of free will, because sort of the presumption that we have it is useful for a lot of things, like criminal charges just wouldn't function if we didn't have free will, because then you could never arrest anybody for anything because it wasn't their fault. It's just how the universe was set up. But I think that we can... First off, I'm interested to hear Vinny's take on this, because I feel like without free will, the whole prospect of Christianity falls apart, because the point of redemption is sort of that you freely choose God, and that's basically the moral indicator. God and Jesus Christ is the moral indicator of whether or not you go to heaven, which seems pretty fundamental to that. But I don't necessarily understand the perspective that free will allows us to choose rationally, or like that the illusion of free will means that it exists, because we can easily deceive ourselves about lots of things. Flat earthers or whatever believe, like, you can, if you choose to be ignorant of something, it doesn't mean that it's not how it is, I guess. So I can believe that the concept of free will is a human concept, but that doesn't necessarily bring it legitimacy, in the same way that if we were having, like, an argument as to God's existence, like, the belief that God exists doesn't necessarily mean that they do. Like, there needs to be some sort of, verifiability, like, as much as I'd like to exist in the world of ideals, I don't think that it can accurately explain things, to the extent that we need it to get these sort of firm axioms, in philosophy and our understanding of humanity.
Because I definitely think, to kind of speak to what you said, Margaret, that Christianity and the moral ideas about redemption and personal obligation get very blurry. And I think they're blurrier than most people give it credit for. Insofar as it's like the eternal question that, like, most Christians hear coming up all the time is, well, if we do have truly an all-loving, all-benevolent God, won't they ultimately forgive us for our broken human action and redeem us all anyways? And if we understand Jesus' message being across time and being eternal, if you buy into, like, the ideas of Catholicism and, like, specifically kind of, like, you can see some of these philosophical undertones in the conception of purgatory, that if Jesus' sacrifice was really across time and eternal, there is no reason that, say, the dead soul of Socrates would not be given the opportunity to have redemption, because Jesus' sacrifice stands for all time, both past, present, and future. So insofar as we grapple with that in terms of free will, a lot of the philosophical tenets and theological tenets of Christianity don't necessitate free will. Because it is thought of as a closed system. And most religions, although outwardly they don't appear it, resemble something more akin to a closed system, such as, like, and this is probably a bad and inaccurate comparison, but such as Hinduism, insofar that it's a closed system that continually repeats. It is not a necessity at the end of the day for that religion if free will exists or not. However, like, in Catholicism at least, and in the Christian world, that's where you fall into the ideas of determinism and fall into predestination, condemned as a heresy, and you fall into all these ideas. However, as much as I hate to say it and kick myself for it, John Calvin was kind of right insofar that it's unnecessary for Christianity to actually have free will or not.
Did I just hear you agree with John Calvin?
I agree with the fact that John Calvin pointed out a problem. I agree with nothing that John Calvin actually said.
There we go.
But I agree with him insofar that he pointed out an issue with Christianity that was vague and ill-defined, and has remained vague and ill-defined for the entire existence of Christianity. So, and that's where I really waffle. Just me personally as well with my own Catholicism, is that is free will fundamentally a necessity to fit within that moral system? And depending on who you talk to, yes and no.
Well, it's always struck me as really strange. Like in the Inferno from Dante, you get that like very vivid depiction of Hellenic people who basically go to purgatory, right? Like the outermost circle of hell, because they didn't believe in Jesus, but they also like didn't have that option because Christianity didn't exist at that point. So that sort of question brings to me a lot of difficulties with religion in particular on this topic, because is it like if you're ignorant of one of your choices, like if you had every single choice but you're ignorant of most of them, how can we determine that to be free will? Because free will would surely be choosing outside of circumstance, at least as I would perceive it.
And I would say the biggest example and biggest question, did Judas have free will? Because Judas's betrayal necessitates Jesus' sacrifice and the entire saving message of Christianity. When Judas acted to betray Jesus, did Judas act in a context of free will? Because without that singular action, Christianity doesn't work and never exists.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that would present a difficult question for Christianity.
Exactly, and it's vague and ill-defined in Christianity.
Well, and I mean, there's like heavy prediction, right? Immediately following that, is it Paul who gets the like chicken crow thing or whatever? Peter. Okay.
Wait,
so,
what? The what
like,
thing?
Is it Jesus tells Peter that he will betray him like 3 times before the cock crows or something like that, and then that prophecy comes through?
So when all of them, he's
yeah.
like, one of you will betray me tonight. Peter says, surely it's not I, Lord, and he says, amen, amen. Peter, you will betray me. 3 times before the cock crows this night, or whatever.
Oh, okay.
Well, yeah, prophecy factors into this in sort of a weird way, too, because we get, like, these early Hellenic depictions where basically you just can't overcome prophecy by the gods, like Oedipus.
I mean, that's Oedipus, but I think that there's also other examples of fate being overcome. Odin actively fights against fate, in Norse paganism. I think there's also the idea, too, that the fates are given, like, stories, and they are physical, or metaphysical beings in a lot of those not elephants. They are physical beings, and a lot of those elements, you better cut that, whoever's editing this. For example, in Hellenistic example, the 3 fates being 3 women that exists in Norse ideology, it's the Nornir. Does that not imply an element that says you can fight fate when fate are designed to be physical, tangible beings? Obviously, that's not, I think, a super modern way of looking at it, given that we don't have super paganistic perspectives on things, but it is interesting to see how our idea of fate changes when it has a form and is potentially something that could be physically confronted.
And I think the foil to that is, like, the ancient Jews, because there are biblical accounts of not only the ancient Jews, but also the apostles. When they didn't know what to do, they cast lots. And then they did what the lots said, because they believed that it determined the will of God. So even insofar as, like, we see these depictions of fate in paganistic cultures as well, and it's a very deeply rooted thing in Judeo-Christian philosophy as well, that there certainly is just a chance or even a divine will that determines actions.
Well, I think that question presents interesting thoughts whether or not you believe in God, because I mean, we can use my sort of like basis of the universe formation as as God. God is the Big Bang or whatever, right? From my perspective, if we're talking about the lots thing, that means that they'd always fall the same way just due to whatever you can observe at that moment or whatever the foundation of the universe was. For Vinny, that would be God determining that. But with the mythological depiction of it, I feel like the very existence of the fates in Greek and Norse mythology would sort of make it a factor that's predetermined. I actually think that Norse mythology is fairly ripe with it, because, how Ragnarok turns out isn't like something that's variable, right? It's something that's predetermined and so prophesied that it's just going to come out as it's described, correct? Like, Odin dies, Thor dies, Loki dies, Jormungandr. I should speak this better as somebody with some Danish ancestry. But they all die, right? And then Baldur comes back and and Baldur's the singular god, or whatever, if you believe the Christianization.
Yeah. But on the same token, Ragnarok is, actively pushed back against at several points. Does that not imply free will and an avoidance of Ragnarok?
But is it a losing battle? Because, even Christians, I know I've talked about this as well in other private conversations, Paul and especially St. Jerome believed that what we should do is stop having children so that we can force the second coming of Christ to come sooner. Because it's going to come when there's no possibility. So, Jerome actively encouraged and said that, homosexual action was actually more moral than heterosexual action in having children, because we need to force the hand of God to kill the human race so that Jesus comes back sooner.
What? I have never heard that. That's wild.
The early Christians were thinkers. They thought about it, and they were like, wait a minute. We can force Jesus to come back sooner. Stop having kids so that Jesus will come save us all. And that we can
Wait, you're telling me the religion that believes in the omnipotence and, supremacy of God says we can force their hand?
Yes, because...
And there's no conflict.
When there's no humans to save.
There's no issues there.
When there's no humans to save, Jesus has to come back.
But you see the theological conundrum.
Exactly. But keep in mind that all the early Christians are still rolling with ancient world logic about we don't necessarily even conceive of God as a fully omnipotent being until much, much later. And even, a lot of the early church councils, it took us a solid 500 years before we said God is omnipotent and omniscient.
Well, I think that it's a little interesting for this, pushback, prophecy thing. 'Cause, I'm still going off of Oedipus, I guess. But, even the pushback prophecy comes true. So how can you really say that it didn't come out as prophesied, I guess? Even if they're pushing Ragnarok back, it's something that's inevitably going to happen as predicted, right? But the pushing back might also be predicted, for all we know. Although I do find the concept that early Christians basically believed in tricking God to be kind of funny.
I don't know. I mean, this is where I run into my existentialist corner, but does it matter if free will exists? I'm going to exist in my life to the extent of my abilities and one day die and none of it will matter. I don't care.
And that's where I waffle in Christianity as well, because it really doesn't matter whether or not it does. We're all just here, and we all just do what we do.
I'm glad we've all come to the conclusion that this topic doesn't matter, really. I think it might come up... I think it might come up maybe in our consciousness discussion eventually, because I definitely want to talk about that. But that's probably a good ending point with us saying that philosophy doesn't matter. Yeah. Everybody should leave with the understanding of that.
Yep. Alrighty, friends. 5,000 years of human discourse doesn't fucking matter. Doesn't matter at all, because we're all dead in the ground at the end of the day.
Stop having kids. Let's force the second coming of Christ and the end of the world to come sooner, and everything will be fine.
Or if you believe climate change is going to kill us all, absolutely have more children, and I'm certain the end of the world will absolutely come faster, so pick your poison.
Early Christians are just accelerationists. That's my conclusion from this whole discussion. So that was the fun first podcast. We'll definitely do this again pretty soon. I'm so looking forward to editing this. I'm not sure I'll make cuts that Taylor wants me to make, because calling elements elephants is pretty funny. But yeah, so that's fun. Alright.
I can't look stupid at episode 1. Give me till episode 3 to look stupid.